The scripture reading for our call to confession this morning is from Acts chapter 6, verse 1. Now, in those days, when the number of the disciples was multiplying, there arose a complaint against the Hebrews by the Hellenists because their widows were neglected in the daily distribution. Last week we had a one-week hiatus because of the murder of Charlie Kirk, a one-week hiatus in looking at the Westminster Larger Catechism on the 8th commandment, you shall not steal. Today, we're going to return to that, and we read of the duties required in this commandment from question 141 of the Catechism. And those duties are truth, faithfulness, and justice in contracts and commerce between man and man, rendering to everyone his due, restitution of goods unlawfully detained from the right owners thereof. These have been covered in previous exhortations to confession. The duty for today that we're going to look at, the phrase from the Catechism is, giving and lending freely according to our abilities and the necessities of others. Today's duty is that of charity. The biblical passage from Acts that I read earlier about neglecting the Greek widows and the distribution of bread among the earliest church brings this duty into focus. This passage is what we refer to when we see the diaconate being established, the office of the deacon. Deacons like our own, we soon will have two deacons. Deacons like our own usually manage the day-to-day operational expenses of the church, making sure that there are enough paper towels and soap and so on. But the passage in Acts reminds us, as does the duty in the larger catechism, that the deacons were originally established to distribute food to those that are in need. In this, they were continuing the Old Testament tradition of the Levites. And for most of the 1900 years after the book of Acts was written, the church functioned as the provider for the poor in need. That changed in the West with the rise of big government in the last century, so that now the government does that providing for the poor, which, of course, has led to all sorts of societal ills, permanent generational poverty, the breakup of the family, the establishment of a new kind of slavery, one where the slave is free to walk away anytime they want to, except that the economic circumstances make it too easy to stay enslaved. This is not how it should be. As James would say, this is not right. As I said, it is not how it has been for most of history since biblical times. The church did the providing for the poor through the diaconate. This was true in the later Roman Empire, where even persecuting emperors like Diocletian thought the Christians did a wonderful job of taking care of the poor. It was true in Calvin's Geneva, where Calvin would actually take two offerings every Lord's Day during worship, one for church expenses and one to cover caring for the poor. It was also true in Scotland during the time of Thomas Chalmers. When the government took over caring for the poor, the modern evangelical church let it happen. One reason they did so was out of a greater concern for personal piety and salvation, and less for the societal aspects of Christianity, which is where we find ourselves today. A government that enslaves all the poor by perpetuating their poverty, and a church that stays out of the way. I mean, after all, I pay taxes. I pay a lot of taxes for the government to do this job, so they ought to be doing it. That argument is about the same as saying, I pay taxes for the public schools. I'm sure going to make sure I get my money's worth by sending my kids there. In fact, when we look at the huge governmental welfare system, the problem seems insurmountable. How are we going to deal with something that big? I mean, I don't know what the budget for HHS is, but it's astronomical. And they spend a great deal more than they get. And so that problem seems insurmountable, much as education did 40 years ago. Now there are a myriad of Christian schools. Now there are untold families that homeschool. So it is possible to overcome a huge problem with small steps. The church needs to be in the charity business. All through Scripture, we read of the need to take care of the poor, the widow, and the fatherless, and those in distress, especially those of the household of faith. As Christians, we can sin in this manner in a number of ways. First, it is too easy to keep following the cultural norms in regard to charity. It is too easy to let the culture invade our thinking about charity. We do not allow this in something like gender discussion. In the same way, we must not let our thinking be the cultural zeitgeist on this issue either. We can also sin by not thinking in advance about what will be required for the church to properly administer for the poor. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, the chapter about not taking your Christian brothers to court, there is an implication that the churches set up their own court system to decide interpersonal church matters. It would be easy to see such a court of deacons. Sorry, I lost my place. It would be easy to see such a court of deacons to decide in the distribution of resources to the poor, deciding between the truly poor and those that just don't want to work. We can also sin by thinking we have to fix the entire government system of welfare all at once, rather than by helping those in our midst that are most in need. Do not despise the day of small beginnings, it says in Zechariah 4:10. We started small in reforming Christian education. We can also start small in reforming Christian charity. And as Christians, we can also sin in the usual ways, by being greedy and by thinking that it is not our job to take care of the poor. Okay, wasn't my phone. We need to confess our sin, these sins, our sin in how we approach Christian charity, plus all the many other ways that we stumble. We need to confess our sin in order to worship a righteous and a holy God. I therefore invite you to kneel with me, confessing your own sin privately, and then corporately reciting the prayer of confession printed in the bulletin.